Now inside your brain here, deep inside your brain, we have spaces, right? So spaces filled with fluid. So what you see in blue here, this is not tissue. This is actually space in between the tissue filled with fluid. Those chambers or spaces that are filled with fluid, well, the fluid, first off, is called cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, and those cavities that are filled with cerebrospinal fluid are called ventricles. So we're going to have to name these ventricles and the little canals that connect the ventricles together in the upcoming slides. Why do we need CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid? Well, 3 reasons. Gives buoyancy to the brain and spinal cord because when tissue is in fluid, it's lighter. Protects your brain and spinal cord. When you have a fluid layer around this delicate central nervous system, it helps protect from trauma and provides some nourishment to the brain and spinal cord. So we're going to label the ventricles and kind of figure out how it flows, or how the cerebrospinal fluid flows through the ventricles and the rest of the central nervous system. So first off, we have 2 ventricles that are symmetrical, one in the left hemisphere of the brain, one in the right hemisphere in the brain. Those are called lateral ventricles, right there. So we have 2 lateral ventricles that fill up with this fluid, this cerebrospinal fluid, and carries, or that cerebrospinal fluid flows from the lateral ventricles to this ventricle right here, which is called the third ventricle. And the third ventricle, which looks real narrow, is wider on this view from the lateral view. So there's your third ventricle. And what connects the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle right there, or right there, those little connection points, are called interventricular foramen. So there's little holes, foramen, that connect those ventricles together, interventricular between ventricles. So cerebrospinal fluid in the lateral ventricles flows through these little holes, interventricular foramen from each side, into the third ventricle. And then from the third ventricle, cerebrospinal fluid will flow to the fourth ventricle. So this little canal right here that connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, you can see it right there as well, right, is called the cerebral aqueduct. An aqueduct is a waterway. In this case, it's not water, it's cerebrospinal fluid. So there's your process, right? Lateral ventricles through the interventricular foramen into the third ventricle to the fourth through the cerebral aqueduct. So those are all the parts of this ventricle system. So cerebrospinal fluid is produced in all 4 ventricles, and then it's going to flow around the brain and spinal cord, because remember the subarachnoid space of the meninges? Well, that's where that fluid will flow around through, which we'll see in another picture. All right, so I'm going to introduce a few things on this slide here. That's all words, and then we'll see it in the picture on the next slide. So your lateral ventricles, you might recall those C-shaped ventricles that are on either side of the brain. They're symmetrical to each other. They're separated by a wall. It's called a septum pellucidum. So septum pellucidum separates the 2 lateral ventricles. And then how does the cerebrospinal fluid get from the ventricles to the subarachnoid space to flow around the brain and spinal cord? Well, through holes, which we call apertures. There's a median and a lateral aperture. Well, that's fine, but that's how that cerebrospinal fluid gets to that subarachnoid space. Remember, that's the space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. We said cerebrospinal fluid is produced inside the ventricles, all 4 ventricles. That's true because all 4 ventricles have something called a choroid plexus, which are specialized blood vessels, and that's where the fluid comes from. So it's fluid from the blood, from this choroid plexus in each ventricle. It's not red, it's clear, because red blood cells stay in the vessels where the clear part of blood is allowed to enter the ventricles. And we're going to see a picture of this, which will hopefully make it a little clearer. So let's go to the next slide. So here we see the 4 ventricles and their connections again. Remember, the cerebral aqueduct is a connection. Interventricular foramina, those are connections, but there's your lateral ventricles. What separates the 2 lateral ventricles from the previous slide? Well, there it is, septum pellucidum. I don't really see a septum pellucidum there, but it's just the separation of the 2 lateral ventricles. And then cerebrospinal fluid is produced in these lateral ventricles, flows to the third ventricle, more is produced in the third ventricle, flows through the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle, more cerebrospinal fluid is produced in the fourth ventricle as well, and then goes through those apertures right into the subarachnoid space. So we'll see a few things a little better on the next slide. So this is a cross section through the brain. And here we can't see the lateral ventricles because the slice has gone right through the septum pellucidum, but you can see the third ventricle here. We can see the fourth ventricle here right in front of the cerebellum. So what we see in each ventricle are these blood vessels, this kind of clumped together, these capillaries. They're specialized. That's what a choroid plexus is. So a choroid plexus, all four ventricles have a choroid plexus. We only see two ventricles in this picture, so each of them is going to have a choroid plexus. And you see those arrows coming out. That's fluid leaving the blood, clear part of blood. So this clear fluid leaves the blood. You can see the red blood cells stay put inside the choroid plexus. So that's what the cerebrospinal fluid is. So you can see it flowing out of the choroid plexus into the third ventricle, right? And then you see the arrow here. There's the cerebral aqueduct. This fluid will flow into the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle has a choroid plexus, so more fluid is produced in the fourth ventricle, and there are those little apertures, right? So now we see the cerebrospinal fluid that flows around the brain and spinal cord in the subarachnoid space. Remember, this fluid came from the blood, from the choroid plexus in all four ventricles, even though we only see two here. And that fluid is going to return to the blood. You can see it right there, through these little arachnoid villi, these little bumps coming up from the subarachnoid space, and we're going into the blood again. This is called the superior sagittal sinus. A sinus is a large vein right here. So cerebrospinal fluid comes from the blood, comes from the choroid plexus in each ventricle, right, and returns to the blood into the superior sagittal sinus through these arachnoid villi around the brain. So that's kind of the cycle of cerebrospinal fluid. And one other thing I didn't mention is that, yes, cerebrospinal fluid flows in the subarachnoid space, but also in the central canal. Remember, there's a little canal inside the spinal cord. It'll flow in there as well. Right, and this is just a close-up right here of a choroid plexus. And yeah, probably a little more than you need here, but we do need to mention these cells that surround the choroid plexus, which you can't see here, but when you enlarge it and look at a kind of a microscopic picture of it where you can actually see the cells, right? So this is a little piece of choroid plexus. There's fluid leaving the blood. Some waste enters the blood actually, but there's cerebrospinal fluid leaving the blood. And what do we see around the choroid plexus? These neuroglia, all these cells that we've seen last chapter called ependymal cells. And ependymal cells, we learned, have cilia. There's the cilia that beat, that help sweep or move along the cerebrospinal fluid that's leaving the choroid plexus.